All right, so I am Lincoln Coffman. I'm the Lifeline Peer Coordinator for Shelby County. I'm gonna go ahead and get this out of the way. I'm an alcoholic. That would be a big deal for me to say that, except I've been on the news a handful of times and they basically cut out my interview and narrowed it down to me just saying to the entire city, I'm an alcoholic. So a lot of people have already heard this before via television. Not really a big deal anymore. I didn't know they were going to do that, but that's what happened. I think the first interview that happened was during 2020 when she was interviewing me on Zoom meetings, when Zoom meetings really blew up, like 12-step Zoom meetings, which I was advocating for them, and I do believe they saved a lot of lives. I know at least a few people that were able to connect with recovery via Zoom, so that was pretty important. All right. I gotta do both of these, I guess. Here we go. All right, so alcohol, the word. I have heard people say that they thought that the word etymologically related back to an evil spirit. It does not. It actually relates back to the word kohl, an Arabic word that was the dark powder they put on their eyes. And it is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid that is produced by the natural fermentation of sugars and is the intoxicating constituent of wine, beer, spirits, and other drinks, and is also used as an industrial solvent and as fuel. So there you go, we're putting that in our bodies. All right, so let's go on a magical journey with this TED Talk here. It's about 5 minutes approximately. Let's see if we can get it working. I also want to thank the audio-visual guys that are back there.
This chimpanzee stumbles across a windfall of overripe plums. Many of them have split open, drawing him to their intoxicating fruity odor. He gorges himself and begins to experience some strange effects. This unwitting ape has stumbled on a process that humans will eventually harness to create beer, wine, and other alcoholic drinks. The sugars in overripe fruit attract microscopic organisms known as yeasts. As the yeasts feed on the fruit sugars, they produce a compound called ethanol, the type of alcohol in alcoholic beverages. This process is called fermentation. Nobody knows exactly when humans began to create fermented beverages. The earliest known evidence comes from 7000 BCE in China, where residue in clay pots has revealed that people were making an alcoholic beverage from fermented rice, millet, grapes, and honey. Within a few thousand years, cultures all over the world were fermenting their own drinks. Ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians made beer throughout the year from stored cereal grains. This beer was available to all social classes, and workers even received it in their daily rations. They also made wine, but because the climate wasn't ideal for growing grapes, it was a rare and expensive delicacy. By contrast, in Greece and Rome, where grapes grew more easily, wine was as readily available as beer was in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Because yeasts will ferment basically any plant sugars, ancient peoples made alcohol from whatever crops and plants grew where they lived. In South America, people made chicha from grains, sometimes adding hallucinogenic herbs. In what's now Mexico, pulque, made from cactus sap, was the drink of choice, while East Africans made banana and palm beer. And in the area that's now Japan, people made sake from rice. Almost every region of the globe had its own fermented drinks. As alcohol consumption became part of everyday life, some authorities latched onto effects they perceived as positive. Greek physicians considered wine to be good for health, and poets testified to its creative qualities. Others were more concerned about alcohol's potential for abuse. Greek philosophers promoted temperance. Early Jewish and Christian writers in Europe integrated wine into rituals, but considered excessive intoxication a sin. And in the Middle East, Africa, and Spain, an Islamic rule against praying while drunk gradually solidified into a general ban on alcohol. Ancient fermented beverages had relatively low alcohol content, at about 13% alcohol. The byproducts wild yeasts generate during fermentation become toxic and kill them. When the yeasts die, fermentation stops and the alcohol content levels off. So for thousands of years, alcohol content was limited. That changed with the invention of a process called distillation. 9th century Arabic writings describe boiling fermented liquids to vaporize the alcohol in them. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, so it vaporizes first. Capture this vapor, cool it down, and what's left is liquid alcohol much more concentrated than any fermented beverage. At first, these stronger spirits were used for medicinal purposes. Then, spirits became an important trade commodity because unlike beer and wine, they didn't spoil. Rum made from sugar harvested in European colonies in the Caribbean became a staple for sailors and was traded to North America. Europeans brought brandy and gin to Africa and traded it for enslaved people, land, and goods like palm oil and rubber. Spirits became a form of money in these regions. During the Age of Exploration, spirits played a crucial role in long-distance sea voyages. Sailing from Europe to East Asia and the Americas could take months, and keeping water fresh for the crews was a challenge. Adding a bucket of brandy to a water barrel kept water fresh longer because alcohol is a preservative that kills harmful microbes. So by the 1600s, alcohol had gone from simply giving animals a buzz to fueling global trade and exploration, along with all their consequences. As time went on, its role in human society would only get more complicated. Tracing the history of our industry and agriculture gives us a fascinating look at what we value as a species and how we've ended up where we are today. Check out these 2 lessons for a super specific and eye-opening look at why we're like this.
Okay. All right, so I think since that video was made, we found that in Haifa, Israel, in some caves, that they've even found evidence of alcohol in pottery from 13,000 years before the Common Era. So that's how old it is. I mean, basically, and I'm kind of quoting Edward Slingerland here, who's one of the authors I credit at the end of this, that we've been drinking alcohol as long as we've been doing anything as a species. It's been a technology that we've used. The big question is, what do we use it for, right? I, as an alcoholic, identify as an alcoholic. What does that really mean to me? And I've been in recovery upwards of 16 years now. And what it means to me is my family's thinking, my immediate family, my sister and both my parents, they still drink. They still drink. Something very different happens to them when they put alcohol in their body than when I put alcohol in my body, right? And in recovery, it really no longer bothers me. It's not something I really even think about very much. But it was something that I did not understand. They didn't understand it. And I literally didn't understand what was going on for most of my life until I was well into my 30s, you know, and I started getting educated on this. So one job as a lifeliner and working with the Memphis Area Prevention Coalition and the Church Health Center is to reduce stigma. Like several presenters have already talked about, I'm not here to demonize or condemn alcohol at all. I want to speak about it objectively, but for me, and you can see this number down at the bottom of this slide, like an estimated 15% of the world's population is prone to alcohol use disorder, and therefore subject to the stigma around it. Well, I'm one of those 15%, right? But we can see that that it's just been around forever. Like Israel, 13,000 BCE, China, 7,000 BCE, Samaria, 4,000, Egypt, 3,000, used in religious rituals, medicine, social gatherings, big in the labor force in Egypt. And, you know, it has a biological and a psychological element to it. So we have, as a species, we've been particularly driven to seek intoxication, and alcohol is a neurotoxin. Other species exhibit this as well, like it just talked about in that video. Recently I remember seeing a study about fruit flies and how fruit flies who are rejected in the mating process will turn to fermented fruit. Even a tiny insect uses alcohol as technology to kind of get over whatever you want to call that, unrequited love or whatever you want to call it. So one thing, though, that I didn't know, it deregulates the prefrontal cortex. Therefore, the technology, we've got this kind of executive functioning going on in the front of our brain, and it helps deregulate that. It helps us step back out of that. That the prefrontal cortex controlling planning, organization, impulses, focus, reasoning. I don't know about y'all, but sometimes mine can go overboard. I would say, a lot historically. It also interferes with creativity, which is why historically we see over time a lot of artists, poets, musicians celebrate alcohol and drinking. But it's not just a depressant, and I didn't really know that. It's also a stimulant. It boosts serotonin production, endorphins. It contributes to that sense of euphoria and increased social ability, lowering inhibitions. There's a journalist that calls alcohol a pharmacological hand grenade because it's not just a depressant. They can see similarities with it, and even crystal methamphetamine, cocaine, it has similarities to that even, not just a depressant. But we've been using it also as medicine, for a long time, also in that video. What I've learned, though, I had a dentist and I had like a cut in my mouth. This happened several years ago, and he said, just put some alcohol on it. And I noticed when I did that, for me, and this is just my experience, it got worse. It hurt worse. It wasn't just killing the bacteria and the microbes in my mouth. It was killing the tissue in my mouth. So we've used it topically, and medicinally, alcohol can kill human tissue, particularly in high concentrations or when used incorrectly for wound care even. Its mechanisms of action include protein denaturation and dehydration, which can lead to cell damage and even death of cells. And while it's effective as a disinfectant, it shouldn't be used to clean wounds as it can further damage healthy tissue. This is the National Institute on Health. The metabolism of alcohol within us results in generation of biochemical moieties, which just means these molecule parts, actually like a shared molecule part, that damage healthy tissue, in our gastrointestinally and all that. And this is from the health.harvard.edu, even among the positive studies, potential health benefits are often quite small. In addition, alcohol may reduce the risk of one condition, such as cardiovascular disease, while increasing the risk of another, such as cancer. It's hard to predict who might actually benefit and who may be harmed more than helped by alcohol consumption. The balance of risk and benefit likely varies from person to person based on individual factors such as genetics, which would be the biology, and lifestyle factors, which might be the psychology of it. So let's look at the neurological effects of alcohol, and these are the short-term effects. We'll get to the long-term effects in a minute. So short-term, impaired memory, cognitive function. It disrupts the hippocampus, a brain region responsible for memory formation and retrieval. It alters our decision-making and impulse control and affects the prefrontal cortex, which we talked about, reduces coordination and balance. It impairs the cerebellum, which is the region responsible for motor coordination, and that's why you see the people on the side of the road doing the DUI test and stuff like that. It does create a feeling of euphoria and relaxation. It increases levels of neurotransmitters like GABA, promoting the feelings of calmness and well-being. And as a depressant, it does cause drowsiness and even sedation. So Malcolm Gladwell, and I credit him at the end of this too, who wrote a really good book. He kind of looks at hangovers a lot. Now, full disclosure, I was a blackout drunk, what we call a blackout drunk. And a lot of people might have trouble understanding that. And I literally, I remember very little of my 20s. I mean, it lasted that long. I probably started drinking really heavily once I became legally of age to to buy it, and I was able to get it, and I blacked out immediately. And to me, that was normal. To me, I kind of just assumed everybody kind of forgot aspects of the previous night or something like that, you know? So it was kind of news to me that other people weren't being affected the same way as me. But when we're looking at things like hangovers, alcohol withdrawal, which is AW, and blackouts, sometimes there's an overlap that exists between hangovers and symptoms of mild withdrawal. You know, with the most important thing is with a hangover, you know, it can occur after a single bout of drinking, right? Whereas with withdrawal, it usually occurs after multiple repeated bouts. But even that can even be only a few, where your body's actually withdrawing from the substance. So with blackouts, there are gaps in a person's memory for events that occurred while they were intoxicated. And there are two types. And I experienced both of these. The first one being fragmentary, which is characterized by spotty memory for events with islands of memories separated by missing periods of time in between. So the next day, I would have some information, but not all of the information, and other people might fill this in or something like that. I might ask a few questions if I was brave enough, like, where did we go after that, or something like that. But then I also, and that's referred to as a gray out or a brown out, but then there's also complete amnesia, complete shutdown of the hippocampus, often spanning hours, which they call an in-block blackout, where there were times where I was like, I don't remember anything from what happened. And, you know, either people would fill me in or I would just try and go on with my life and not even try and fill in the blanks with that. They tend to begin with the blood alcohol level concentrations of about 0.16%, which is about twice the legal driving limit and higher. All right. So long-term effects. Let's look at the neurological long-term. Whoops, did this go backwards? Okay, there we go. 1 second. So long-term. Brain shrinkage. Chronic alcohol abuse could lead to the reduction in brain volume, particularly in areas involved in memory, learning, and decision-making. It can damage neurons and brain cells. It is a neurotoxin. Increased risk of brain disorders. Heavy alcohol consumption is associated with an increased risk of developing brain conditions such as dementia, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. It alters the brain chemistry and structure. Chronic alcohol use can permanently alter the balance of neurotransmitters and the structure of brain circuits, leading to long-term cognitive and behavioral problems. And then the impaired executive function, which has to do with the prefrontal cortex, impairing our ability to plan, organize, and make sound decisions. All right, so what about other health effects besides the brain? Well, with the liver, and we'll get into this more in a minute, you've got cirrhosis, fatty liver disease. With the brain, cognitive decline, memory loss. With the heart, high blood pressure, cardiomyopathy, and then cancer. And it lists a few here, but there's more, and we'll get into that in a second. So the CDC and the Surgeon General warnings these days say there's no safe alcohol consumption level for cancer prevention. I grew up in a time when people would say, you know, it's healthy to have a few drinks, especially a couple glasses of wine or something like that. They're not really saying this anymore. But that's what I was hearing at the time. So not only is it a neurotoxin, but alcohol is a carcinogen. It's classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and alcohol consumption is linked to an increased risk of developing 7 types of cancer, including breast cancer in women, esophageal cancer, liver cancer, oral cancer, so of the mouth and throat, laryngeal cancer, the voice box, and pancreatic cancer. So we've looked at the biology of it, some of the psychology of it. You know, let's look at the social component. It's been historically used for communal purposes, labor in Egypt, particularly rituals and banquets. And Egypt didn't just use it to kind of reward labor but also to control like certain populations as well. And then with the emergence of distillation, which is estimated at about 2000 before the Common Era, the consumption of spirits brought about heightened levels of symptoms and what we call AUD these days. And if you look at different cultures, and this one is going to take like Europe in particular, like Northern European, they'll look at the kind of like the cultural aspects of that, and then Southern European, like Italy. A lot more people drink like distilled things like vodka and stuff, especially in places like Russia. But in Italy, and I actually had experience with this, they might have a couple glasses at each meal. Even children have a couple glasses. I stayed with a family once in Ferrara, Italy, which is northern Italy, kind of near Bologna, and they made their own sparkling wine. And so every time I sat down with them, like 3 times a day, we would have a couple glasses of sparkling wine, and I would, I was watching them do this, and they, it was nothing to them. To me, I just wanted to go have another one, or I would just be like, can I have another glass? I didn't ask for that. But they had those kind of societal signals or cultural kind of clues to say, hey, this is what is acceptable, And it's different for different cultures. Like in some cultures, you might grow up at a place where they drink spirits, where they drink like something like vodka, and they drink it a lot, So I think it's important to be aware of that. So in the United States, what do we have here? What are we really looking at? We've pretty much condemned tobacco, big tobacco especially, right? And they've had to answer for all these things. But we have alcohol, which is also a carcinogen, which also causes cancer. And yet, like, what are the differences between the ways we're affected by these, what's advertised, the way it's promoted in our culture? Like, how are we really looking at it? Are we really looking at it as this thing that actually causes all these problems and damages us and creates, like, all these, adverse symptoms and stuff? Or are we treating it differently? I thought about, when I was doing this, I thought a lot about like distillation and kind of what we're seeing, and this was mentioned in a previous presentation about the concentrated, like we're looking at people who use these crazy amounts of concentrated of a substance, that are so like 3 to 10 times higher than what it used to be, not only with like THC, with, when we're seeing fentanyl, which is like, so much stronger than heroin, than an opiate. But we're doing that with alcohol too. It's distilled. We're literally, it's called spirits because it's literally pulling the vapor out of it and putting it somewhere else. And we're just drinking like the straight alcohol from that. So one thing you see in our culture, drive-through liquor stores. I don't think those are popular in a lot of other cultures. I don't think people drive up by it and probably drink it on the way home. And then you've got private use, and that's where you're getting into like the social component. Historically, it was a communal thing. People did it, and it lowered their inhibitions. They were able to function more socially or whatever without the anxiety or whatever was going on. But here, it's perfectly normal just to go home and drink, and I know it was for me, So it's just things to look at. During COVID, it was considered an essential business for these liquor stores to stay open. Essential to our culture. And we have the lack of societal signals and overuse that other cultures have, where I think you'll find, if you look at the data, they have less problems with it. And over time, we've had these ominous warnings or red flags throughout history of people, advocating for different ways to try and curb like excessive drinking. You have Confucius, who emphasized, while it's acceptable, you shouldn't become confused or lose control. That's 500 years before the Common Era. And then Aristotle after that, viewing it as vice-related to self-indulgent. Seneca in Rome, emphasizing moderation and self-control, arguing that excessive drinking leads to loss of control, impaired judgment, and other vices. And that's, 65 Common Era. I looked at the Bible, and I tried to go back as far as I could. You do have Noah and Lot in Genesis and how, they drank and it led to acts of immorality or whatever. But in Leviticus, God commanded priests not to drink so that they could tell the difference between the holy and the unholy. And then you have like a similar proverb common to both Ireland and Japan. First man takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. And then you've got F. Scott Fitzgerald, who I'm pretty sure had some experience with this, that first you take a drink, this is the most interesting part to me, then the drink takes a drink, and then the drink takes you. So how did these cultures respond? Well, Prohibition goes back in China to 2070 before the Common Era. And I believe that the consumption and production of alcohol at that time was punishable by death. Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi, going back 1754 BCE, they regulated taverns with strict penalties. Egypt, they controlled the rationing for the labor force productivity. And in Rome, Lex Oppia banned alcohol for women. And in the Middle Ages, monks controlled alcohol production for religious and medicinal use, which brings us to pre-Prohibition USA, which was just talked about so eloquently by Dr. Elmo. We can probably move through this pretty fast since she just covered a lot of it, but there were temperance movements in the 1830s and 1850s, which gained momentum, advocating for alcohol abstinence and leading to state-level prohibition laws, Maine passing the first state prohibition law in 1846. In the 1840s, Massachusetts passed a local option law allowing towns to enact their own prohibition laws. And there was a Washingtonian movement founded in Baltimore, and that membership reached about 600,000 people. But really, you see, it started out as a bunch of men getting together trying to help each other not drink. And they would even meet in taverns and talk about drinking and how to abstain from it and stuff like that. And it gained like this huge following and membership. And it kind of split off when they decided to also become active in politics and other social reform type things like abolition. But anyway, in the 1880s, Kansas became the first state to make prohibition part of its constitution. 1893, the Anti-Saloon League, which is now the American Council on Addiction and Alcohol Problems, which I believe is headquartered in Birmingham, was founded. And they just concentrated on legislation, not so much outreach or prevention or anything like that, but the laws. And then we move into the actual Prohibition era, which has already been covered just probably an hour ago. So the 18th Amendment passed in 1917, and then in 19, it's ratified, becoming a law. And then 1919, the Volstead Act, taking nationwide effect in 1920. And it saw the rise of organized crime, bootlegging, speakeasies. I remember listening to NPR, I think it was NPR, and them talking about how at that time the government would release these huge vats of industrial alcohol that was unpotable, like on purpose. They would make it unpotable for humans to drink, and the bootleggers would get a hold of it and filter it somehow so that they could somehow put it into like alcohol that could be consumed and stuff like that. The support for that waned. I think Congress even celebrated when it was repealed in 1933. But we can go back, almost 100 years and say this is what happened when we did this. This is the effect that took place.
You could go forward 100 years too and discover that it's happening again.
Okay, thank you, Jane. So let's look at related deaths and crime statistics, the effect that it has on our community globally and locally. Globally, 2.6 million deaths annually from alcohol-related causes, okay? U.S. alcohol-related deaths surged by 70% from 2012 to 2022. Crime, 40% of violent crimes involve alcohol. I like, in my job, I like to go into jails. I was one of those people, and I grew up in Nashville, and I'm from Nashville, but the society had to lock me up for my behavior, and needless to say, I didn't get a good amount of like kind of recovery information in jail. It was mostly just kind of like more punishment-oriented type things. But I can say that, like, in my experience, most of the people I talk to in there and the ones I go to here and take meetings to in jail here and stuff, it might be a lot higher than that. It might be higher than 40%. I don't know, but oh yeah, and if anybody has any corrections or updates on any of this information, feel free to contact me after this. It's not like I do a lot of this statistic-wise, but homicide, 7,334 alcohol-related murders per year in the United States. And that Tennessee number, 98% increase in alcohol-related deaths over the past decade. I mean, that's almost 100%. That's a giant leap. So the statistics with DUI and incarceration, 40% of violent crime offenders were intoxicated at the time of the crime. 70% of domestic violence incidents involve alcohol. 25%, which is a quarter, of Tennessee inmates are in prison for alcohol-related offenses. DUI arrests, over 1 million annually in the U.S. I think that number was different. And alcohol-related crashes, 30%, almost a third of U.S. road fatalities. So one thing that that is a part of my story is I did have a best friend that died by suicide in 2019, and me and him were very similar in our drinking habits. He did reach out to me like a month before it happened, and I do believe that AUD was a major factor in him taking his own life. But 800,000 suicides per year worldwide, 2,200 deaths by suicide every day. And these are just suicide statistics. And I got some of this from the QPR Institute. I do QPR trainings, which is suicide prevention trainings. QPR stands for Question, Persuade, Referral. Suicide is a leading cause of death in 1/3 of all countries and accounts for 54% of all violence-related deaths. And it's talking about self-violence. So this is the one that blew me away when I first did the training for QPR. More people die by self-directed violence each year than all other directed violence in the world, and that includes armed conflicts and homicides. That number blew me away. Now, an estimated 40 to 60% have a BAC level, a blood alcohol level exceeding the legal limit in completed suicides. And that includes, I'm sure, my best friend. Alcohol and drugs, and we know this, and we just saw this contribute greatly to the suicide risk in younger people, about the effect it has on the developing brain, like drugs in general, and stuff like that. So let's look at, hope I didn't move past that. So the reason I kind of went through the biological and psychological and then the social was to get to this disease model, which is the biopsychosocial disease model of alcoholism, viewing it as an actual medical condition rather than a moral failing, which emerged in the 18th and early 19th centuries with physicians like Benjamin Rush, who was a colonial doctor. He worked a lot during the yellow fever epidemics. And then there's another one, Thomas Trotter, who was Scottish. This gained wider acceptance in the 20th century through figures like E. Morton Jellinek. He was a researcher at Yale, and he's one of the key figures that had influence on the American Medical Association categorizing alcoholism as a disease. But in 1849, the Swedish physician Magnus Huss coined the term alcoholism in his book Alcoholismus Chronicus. And then going back to 1956, the American Medical Association declared alcoholism was a major medical problem and a chronic progressive illness. The core of this disease model of addiction is the brain hijack theory that posits addiction is a brain disease caused by a dysfunction of brain systems involved in reward and pleasure seeking. So if we try to criminalize that, or look at it as an actual choice, like how is that going to help? How's that going to help an actual illness? When we're looking at someone, like, and this is the way, honestly, I really believe, like, my parents were kind of looking at me, like, saying it just didn't make any sense to them why I was making the decisions I was making. It didn't make any sense to me, you know, but what they saw was a person that was choosing to do this, that was like, you know, had some volition in what was going on. Like, in retrospect, you know, I can say that, like, you know, I kept behaving in a manner I desperately wanted to stop behaving in for a long period of time. I did not want to be doing I definitely didn't want to go to jail, you know, and yet I did, you know, and I definitely didn't want to keep having to face these same circumstances and consequences that I was facing, and yet I did, you know. And I remember I had a moment of realization the last time that I was incarcerated in Nashville. I remember having this realization, and this was a pretty big deal for me, was like, this is going to keep happening for me unless something drastic and radical changes. And I don't think I even know what that is. I don't even think I know how to do that, which kind of led me into the rooms of recovery and stuff like that, and to really start just trying to find some way, you know, to address this thing that seemed to have total control over me. So alcohol use disorder, previously known as alcohol dependence and abuse, was integrated into a single category called substance use disorder, SUD, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which was published in 2013. This is something I heard at the state level from people like Monty Burks, and it really meant a lot to me when I heard this phrase, the opposite of addiction is connection. You know, because this is really at the core of 12-step recovery, which has really been around for almost 100 years now. I think about 90 years. The opposite of addiction is connection. And what happens at the core of 12-step recovery is people connect with each other on a level where one person can understand the other person. Like, you're sitting across the table or a space from someone who really understands what you're talking about. And they feel heard, and they can be honest about what's going on, and there's this connection that happens, you know, and I believe this can happen on a societal level and a community level. And y'all have probably heard about, you know, a lot of y'all have heard about the Rat Park study that happened in the 70s where, you know, they found they were way less likely for these self-administered drugs for these rats that were isolated than the ones that were in this rat park. The ones that were in the rat park didn't go for, you know, the drugged water or whatever. And it highlighted how the environment matters in understanding addiction, which can be translated into human behavior. So while not a complete cure-all, research suggests that strong social connections and meaningful relationships play a crucial role in the overcoming of addiction and maintaining sobriety. And the lack of connection can be a root cause of addiction, and fostering connection can be a powerful tool in recovery. One thing that you will hear, and that I've seen personally, and I do believe based on my experience, is that, you know, one common symptom of addiction and alcoholism is it gets the person alone. It gets them alone. It gets them cut off from other people, their loved ones, society. It gets them alone. It centers in their mind, and then they're just stuck in a space with their own thinking, you know? And that just seems across the board symptomatic to me, in my experience of what I've seen in the rooms of recovery and with the people I've worked with. So let's look at strategies and the effectiveness of prevention strategies. School-based education programs reduce early alcohol use by 20%. Minimum drinking age laws, which we just went through a really good presentation about the laws, reduce underage drinking by deaths by 40%. Higher alcohol taxes lead to 10% decrease in alcohol-related deaths. Public awareness campaigns decrease binge drinking by 25%. These are huge numbers, and community-based interventions have shown a 15% reduction in alcohol-related hospital visits. So when we talk about detox and rehab, and part of my job is to refer people to detox and rehab, some people, like, I've gotten a lot of calls here in Shelby County where people like, you know, he needs detox. He needs to go to MMHI, Memphis Mental Health Institute, or something. And they got those two conflated. They got Alliance and MMHI conflated, where one was for mental health The other one was actually for detox and stuff like that. But when we say detox, we're talking about a set of interventions aimed at managing acute intoxication and withdrawal, and it denotes a clearing of toxins from the physical body, detox, you know. There's also social detox in rehabilitation. But alcohol withdrawal and benzodiazepines as well, they cause these severe reactions and a range of physical and psychological symptoms with alcohol, including seizures, delirium tremens or DTs, and even heart failure. It's really important that a person that is drinking at that level be monitored medically when they're detoxing from alcohol and they're trying to get it completely out of their body. The world rates, this is 17.3% of individuals with alcohol use disorder receive treatment, which is pretty low, with remission rates at 79.5, which is high for alcohol abuse, and 69.7 for alcohol dependence. And in the USA, this is very low. Only 7.9 with alcohol use disorder receive treatment, and 50% though, which is higher, much higher, receiving treatment, remain abstinent from alcohol 1 year after completing treatment. So I'm not here to advocate specifically any modality, but I mean, there's this kind of idea. I think one thing I heard a lot in the rooms of recovery was like, you know, especially with 12-step recovery, only 2%. It only works for like 2% or something like that. But the fact is, I think they're referring to something like permanent sobriety or something like that, whereas relapses are a part of a lot of people's recovery, including mine. I had one relapse after 2 years of sobriety that I needed to have. Like, I really saw the truth about, you know, what happened when I put alcohol in my body. And I really saw the truth about how you know, this thing, I really needed to look at the mental and the physical aspects of this illness that I have, that I identify with. Success rates. All right, cognitive behavioral therapy, 50 to 60% success rate in relapse prevention. That's great. Dialectical behavior therapy, 45% success rate for alcohol use disorder. 12-step programs, long-term success rate estimated at 30 to 50% with continued participation. Smart recovery, which is basically CBT, specifically rational emotive behavioral therapy, 40 to 60% effectiveness for sustained sobriety. I'm also a facilitator for smart recovery meetings, which were developed by a Harvard professor in the 1990s. Then there's Celebrate Recovery, which is specifically Christian, over 5 million members in the United States and 35,000 churches. And I think these are old numbers too. Both of these numbers are probably a little bit higher. And Recovery Dharma, which is Buddhist, over 16,000 members. So these faith-based and mindfulness-based approaches are showing increasing success, and the numbers are getting bigger and bigger with those. All right, so alcohol's just played a major role in human civilization since the beginning. It's a technology that we've used for very specific reasons, and it has, you know, I think it helps for us to become more aware of what the actual effects are. It's also led to major health and crime issues. Prevention and treatment strategies, as well as stigma reduction, are key to mitigating the harm, but continued research and policy efforts are necessary to reduce alcohol-related deaths and addiction. So these are two books that I kind of got interested in when I was researching this stuff. Two people that I think, you know, these aren't strictly like kind of statistical type publications. They're really entertaining too. Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers, he talks a lot about like the effects on the hippocampus and stuff like that, and he's a really good writer. And then the second one, Edward Slingerland's book, Drunk, which is a couple years later, is really just this, it's pretty entertaining story of like our relationship with alcohol throughout history, you know. I mean, the truth is, like, up until, you know, I started realizing what was going on and facing all these consequences. Like, I had this complete torrid love affair with alcohol. I mean, it worked the way I wanted it to work. You know, it helped me in all these, and especially with the whole deregulating the prefrontal cortex, lowering inhibition. I had all this social anxiety that seemed to go away. It worked for me in this specific way, but it definitely, for me, quit working, and I became extremely antisocial in other ways. But I think these are two books that are not only like really good and kind of deep diving, but also entertaining publications. And you can find like them talking about them on YouTube and stuff like that. So, and I want to thank Sarah Mays, because she's actually the one that developed, that made me this digital card that I've had for years here. This is my card. On the left, it's got my cell phone number on it, Lifeline Peer Coordinator. It's got my email on it. You can contact me. I answer calls for the Tennessee Red Line, and I try to connect people with services here in Shelby County and across the state. I'm a CPRS, which means I have lived experience, not only with alcoholism and addiction, but also with recovery from those. I work for the Memphis Area Prevention Coalition. I'd like to thank my whole team. They're amazing people. I love them. And Church Health Center and Butch Odom as well, and the Lifeline Peer Project. I guess that's all I got.